December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Joachim Peiper stood in the turret of his Tiger II tank, watching the fog settle over the frozen forest like a burial shroud. Behind him, 117 tanks and assault guns idled in perfect concealment, their crews silent, their engines running just enough to prevent freezing in the -10 degrees cold. Ahead, through the mist, lay the American lines. Green troops, understaffed positions, the weakest point in the entire Allied front, exactly as intelligence had promised. Peiper checked his watch. 25 minutes until the artillery barrage would begin. 30 minutes until his Kampfgruppe, battle group, would smash through American defenses and drive 85 miles to the Meuse River, cutting the Allied armies in half and perhaps forcing a negotiated peace in the West. Everything depended on speed. Everything depended on surprise. Everything depended on the Americans doing exactly what German intelligence predicted they would do: collapse in panic when elite SS Panzer divisions struck from the fog. What Peiper didn't know, what none of the 200,000 German soldiers massed in the Ardennes forests knew, was that in exactly 48 hours, Hitler's master plan would be revealed not as Germany's salvation, but as the Wehrmacht's death certificate. That the greatest German offensive in the West since 1940 would destroy the last mobile reserves Hitler possessed, that American soldiers the Wehrmacht dismissed as soft and inexperienced would stand and fight with a determination that would shatter every German assumption about their enemies. In 48 hours, Joachim Peiper would be surrounded, his fuel exhausted, watching his supposedly unstoppable panzers become immobile monuments to German desperation. In 48 hours, entire German divisions would be ground to pieces by American artillery, air power, and the stubborn courage of soldiers who refused to break. In 48 hours, Hitler's last gamble would become Germany's last hope, dying in the snow of Belgium. But at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, Peiper still believed. They all believed. The Wehrmacht was about to teach the Americans the price of underestimating German arms. The next 48 hours would teach the Wehrmacht something far more painful: that wars are not won by tactical brilliance alone, and that the American military they had dismissed as amateurish had become something Germany could no longer defeat. The mathematics of desperation had driven Hitler to this moment. By December 1944, the strategic situation was catastrophic. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Red Army stood on Germany's borders, having destroyed 25 divisions in Operation Bagrotan during the summer. The Western Allies had liberated France and stood poised to cross the Rhine into Germany itself. German cities burned under Allied bombing. Oil production had dropped 90% from pre-war levels. The Luftwaffe was grounded by fuel shortages. Yet Hitler, in his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, had conceived a plan he believed would reverse everything. The concept was audacious, perhaps brilliant, certainly desperate. Strike through the Ardennes forest, the same route that had brought victory in 1940. Split the American and British armies. Capture the port of Antwerp, the Allies' primary supply hub. Force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, freeing German forces to concentrate against the Soviets. The plan's success required a dozen conditions, all of which had to align perfectly. Absolute surprise. Rapid breakthrough before Allied reserves could react. Capturing American fuel dumps intact to sustain the advance. Whether preventing Allied air superiority from being decisive. American forces panicking and retreating rather than fighting. For 48 hours, most of these conditions would hold. Then, reality would assert itself with brutal finality. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Mantelfil, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, understood the plan's impossibility even as he prepared to execute it. His diary, captured after the war, revealed his private assessment written on December 15th. We are asked to drive 85 miles through enemy territory, across rivers, through towns, capturing fuel as we advance because we don't have enough to reach our objectives. We must do this in winter, with divisions at half strength, with new tanks that have never been in combat, with fuel reserves sufficient for perhaps 50 miles. The Führer believes American morale is fragile, that they will collapse when struck with determination. I pray he is correct, because if the Americans stand and fight, we lack the resources to break them. But Mantelfil would execute his orders, because he was a soldier, and because some part of him, the part shaped by 1940's stunning victory, wanted to believe that German tactical excellence could still overcome material disadvantage. The force Hitler had assembled for what he codenamed Operation Wacht on the Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, represented the last mobile reserves Germany possessed. 28 divisions, 200,000 men in the first wave, with 100,000 more in reserve. 1,900 artillery pieces gathered from every front. 1,400 tanks and assault guns, including 45 of the massive Tiger II King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world. 1,000 aircraft, the Luftwaffe's largest concentration since 1943, scraped together from pilot training schools and homeland defense units. This force had been assembled in absolute secrecy, a remarkable achievement given Allied air superiority and intelligence capabilities. Divisions moved only at night. Radio silence was total. Deception operations suggested German forces were preparing defenses, not attacks. The surprise would be complete. But the force itself revealed Germany's desperation in ways Hitler refused to acknowledge. The divisions were at 50 to 70% strength. Many soldiers were teenagers or men over 35, scraped from rear echelon units. Tank crews had minimal training, some with less than 10 hours operating their vehicles. The panzers included captured French, Czech, and Soviet equipment pressed into German service. Fuel reserves were calculated in hours of operation, not days. Most critically, the plan assumed capturing American fuel dumps intact. Without this, the offensive would stall within 48 hours, regardless of tactical success. German intelligence had identified the American sector in the Ardennes as the weakest point in Allied lines. They were correct. The 8th Corps, stretched across 85 miles of front with just 4 divisions, was indeed undermanned. The terrain, dense forests and steep valleys, was considered impassable for armor by American planners. The divisions manning the sector were either green, newly arrived from the States, or veteran units pulled from heavy fighting to rest and refit. General der Waffen-SS Josef Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Army, the main strike force, studied American dispositions with satisfaction on December 15. His assessment, recorded in his operations order, reflected confident contempt. The enemy sector shows typical American disposition: overextended, reliant on mechanical transport, lacking depth. American soldiers fight well when supplied and supported, but break when isolated and attacked with determination. Our Kampfgruppe will penetrate their lines before they comprehend what is occurring. Within 24 hours, we will be behind their front, creating panic. Within 48 hours, we will reach the Meuse. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, not because it misread American dispositions, those were indeed weak, but because it misread American character. At 5:30 a.m., December 16, 1944, 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The barrage lit the winter darkness with muzzle flashes that could be seen from miles away. American positions, isolated strongpoints in small villages and crossroads, disappeared under high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, systematic and devastating. Then silence. Then the fog-shrouded forms of German infantry and panzers emerged from the forest. Private First Class Richard McKee, manning a machine gun position with the 99th Infantry Division near Lanzerath, recorded the opening moments in a letter written 3 weeks later. The shelling came from everywhere at once. We couldn't see it coming through the fog, just heard the screaming and then the explosions. Our log bunker collapsed. 3 men in my squad died immediately. The rest of us were half deaf, bleeding from concussion. Then we heard the tanks, dozens of them, the grinding of tracks on frozen ground. We couldn't see them, just heard them getting closer. Someone yelled that we should run. Our sergeant, his name was Slape, said no. He said we hold here or the whole line breaks. We held. For the next 48 hours, variations of this scene would repeat across the Ardennes. Isolated American units, outnumbered, often surrounded, would be given the choice to retreat or stand. Most would stand. This was the variable German planners had not adequately calculated. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of 6th Panzer Army, consisted of 117 tanks, 149 half-tracks and other vehicles, and 4,800 men. Peiper, at 29, was already a decorated veteran with a reputation for aggressive action and ruthless efficiency. His unit had been promised a clear path to the Meuse once they broke through initial American positions. At 6 a.m., as the artillery barrage lifted, Peiper's lead elements moved forward. They immediately encountered their first problem. The roads through the Ardennes were narrow, often just single lanes winding through dense forest. A single disabled vehicle could block an entire column. Piper's plan required maintaining 20 mph average speed. Within the first hour, his column was barely moving at 5 mph, log-jammed behind reconnaissance units clearing American positions. By 8 a.m., Piper's lead elements reached Lanzerath, where Richard McKee and 18 men of the 99th Infantry Division's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon had been ordered to hold a crossroads. Piper's force, at this point roughly 500 paratroopers supported by his lead tanks, vastly outnumbered the American defenders. Standard doctrine suggested the Americans would retreat or surrender when faced with overwhelming force. They did neither. The 18 Americans held Lanzerath for 3 hours against repeated assaults, inflicting casualties that forced Piper to commit more forces than planned. When the position finally fell at 11 a.m., Piper was already 5 hours behind schedule. Worse, the sound of fighting had alerted other American units that something major was happening. Piper's frustration, recorded in his post-war testimony, revealed the first cracks in German confidence. We expected to brush aside screening forces and drive deep into their rear before they could react. Instead, every crossroads, every village, every bridge became a fight. These were not elite troops. Intelligence identified them as a reconnaissance platoon, support personnel. Yet they fought like Waffen-SS, contested every meter, forced us to deploy and assault properly. By noon, we had advanced perhaps 5 miles. We needed to advance 85 miles in 36 hours. The mathematics already showed failure. To Piper's south, other elements of 6th Panzer Army were experiencing similar delays. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of Germany's most elite formations, had been stopped cold at the twin villages of Rocherath-Krinkelt by elements of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions. The Americans, rather than retreating, had dug in and were fighting building to building in a ferocious defensive battle. Obersturmbannführer Hugo Krass, commanding the 12th SS Panzer, reported to Dietrich at 2 p.m. on December 16th. Enemy resistance is fanatical. We have committed 2 regiments and made negligible progress. American artillery fire is constant and accurate. Their tanks, Shermans we were told would flee from our Panthers, are fighting from prepared positions and inflicting losses. We can break them, but it will take days, not hours. We do not have days. Further south, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was having more success. His forces had struck sectors held by even thinner American forces and were making better progress. But even here, isolated American units were fighting with unexpected determination. At St. Vith, a critical road junction, elements of the 106th Infantry Division, the greenest division in the US Army, had been surrounded but were refusing to surrender. At Bastogne, another crucial crossroads, scattered American units were consolidating into what would become the most famous defensive stand of the battle. The German plan had assumed capturing St. Vith on December 16th and Bastogne on December 17th. Both would become week-long battles. As December 16th progressed, a pattern emerged that would define the next 48 hours. German forces, despite achieving tactical surprise and local superiority, could not maintain the speed their plan required. Every American unit, regardless of experience or strength, was fighting. Not fighting and retreating, fighting and holding. At the Schnee-Eifel, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Division, roughly 8,000 men, were surrounded by December 17th. German commanders expected immediate surrender. The Americans held for 3 days, tying down German forces desperately needed elsewhere. Their eventual surrender, on December 19th, came too late to help the German schedule. By nightfall on December 16th, German forces had penetrated 5 to 12 miles into American lines, depending on sector. This was significant, but far short of the 30 miles planned for the first day. More critically, no major American fuel dumps had been captured. German tanks were already consuming their limited fuel reserves faster than planned due to slow movement through difficult terrain. Piper, the deepest penetration, was still 80 miles from the Meuse, and his fuel gauges showed 60% remaining. His operations officer calculated they had perhaps 24 hours of mobile operations before the Kampfgruppe would be immobilized. Piper made a fateful decision. Rather than waiting for fuel supplies to catch up, he would drive forward, gambling that he could capture American fuel dumps before his tanks ran dry. This aggressive decision would define the next 48 hours of his offensive. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the German offensive had been detected within hours of its start. Initial reports were confused, multiple attacks across a broad front, but the scale became clear by noon on December 16th.
General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, immediately grasped the situation's seriousness and its opportunity. His Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, recorded Eisenhower's assessment at a 3 p.m. staff meeting. The general's first words were, "This is no local attack." He immediately ordered a halt to all Allied offensives and began shifting reserves towards the Ardennes, but his demeanor was not of concern. He said, "The enemy has stuck his head in a meat grinder. Our job is to turn the handle." He saw immediately that the Germans had committed their last mobile reserves to an offensive that, even if initially successful, could not be sustained. Eisenhower's response demonstrated the systematic American approach to warfare that Germans consistently underestimated. Within 6 hours of recognizing the scale of the attack, American forces were being redeployed. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting in France after Operation Market Garden, were alerted and began moving towards Bastogne by truck, a 107-mile journey through winter weather. The 7th Armored Division was ordered south from the Netherlands. The 10th Armored Division was detached from Patton's Third Army and sent north. The 1st Infantry Division was pulled from planned defensive operations and redirected. This level of coordination, moving entire divisions hundreds of miles within 24 hours, was something the Wehrmacht could no longer accomplish. German forces had to plan movements weeks in advance, constrained by fuel shortages and Allied air interdiction. The Americans simply issued orders and moved. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding 8th Corps, the formation bearing the brunt of the German assault, displayed the quality of American leadership that would frustrate every German assumption. Rather than ordering general retreat to consolidate defenses, he issued hold orders to every unit. St. Vith must be held, Bastogne must be held, every crossroads, every bridge, delay the enemy. Engineers will prepare demolitions, infantry will establish strongpoints. We will trade space for time, but we will trade it dearly. These orders would result in thousands of American casualties over the next 48 hours. They would also destroy the German timetable completely. December 17th, 1945. Kampfgruppe Peiper was racing forward, having finally broken free from the log-jammed roads. By dawn, they had reached Stavelot, approximately 25 miles behind the original American front lines. Here, Peiper found what he desperately needed, a massive American fuel dump, containing over 2 million gallons of gasoline. It was barely defended. Peiper's lead tanks approached the dump at 8 a.m. As they did, American engineers detonated prepared charges, igniting the entire facility. A mushroom cloud of burning gasoline rose thousands of feet. Peiper watched Germany's hope for sustained offensive mobility go up in flames. American engineers across the Ardennes had been given one simple order: deny the enemy supplies. They executed it with devastating efficiency. Every fuel dump, every ammunition stockpile, every supply depot in danger of capture was destroyed. The Germans would capture almost nothing of value. Peiper pressed on, his fuel gauges dropping towards critical. His Kampfgruppe was now a spear point driving deep into American territory, but increasingly isolated. American units he had bypassed were not retreating. They were holding position, cutting his supply lines. By noon on December 17th, Peiper had advanced roughly 35 miles from his start point. He was halfway to his objective. He was also out of fuel for half his vehicles, out of communication with higher headquarters, and had American forces ahead, behind, and on both flanks. The myth of German tactical superiority was about to meet the reality of American systematic warfare. Peiper's situation exemplified the larger problem facing the entire German offensive. Tactical success, breaking through American lines, penetrating deep into enemy territory, was being achieved. Strategic success, reaching the Meuse, capturing Antwerp, splitting Allied armies, was becoming impossible. The Americans were not fighting the way German doctrine predicted. They were not breaking. They were not panicking. They were simply fighting. To the south, the town of Bastogne was becoming the critical point of the entire battle. Manteuffel's forces had bypassed it on December 17th, intending to return and capture it later. But by the evening of December 17th, elements of the 101st Airborne Division had reached Bastogne and were digging in. Brigadier General Anthony Macaulay, acting commander of the 101st, assessed the situation on the night of December 17th. His operations officer suggested that the division might need to withdraw if surrounded. Macaulay's response, recorded by multiple witnesses, was characteristic of American command decisions during these 48 hours. Withdraw to where? The Germans are in every direction. We'll dig in here and let them break themselves against us. This was not bravado. It was calculated assessment. Bastogne sat at a critical road junction. 7 major roads converged there. The German offensive required those roads for moving supplies forward. If Bastogne held, the entire southern German advance would be constrained to secondary roads, limiting movement and delaying their already failing timetable.
By midnight on December 17th, 48 hours into the offensive, German forces had penetrated up to 25 miles into American lines at their deepest points. They had surrounded thousands of American soldiers. They had created chaos across the Ardennes, but they had not broken through. They had not captured critical objectives on schedule. They had not captured fuel. Most critically, they had not broken American will to resist. Oberst Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, who had led a German paratrooper drop behind American lines, was captured on December 20th. His interrogation, preserved in American archives, provided a stark assessment of German perceptions after 48 hours. We were told American morale was fragile, that they were garrison troops unprepared for real combat. This was catastrophically wrong. The Americans fought with determination we had not anticipated. Even when surrounded, they did not surrender quickly. Even when outnumbered, they inflicted casualties that disrupted our schedule. By the second day, it was clear to those of us at tactical level that the offensive had already failed. We had not achieved breakthrough. We would not reach the Meuse. The only question was how many of us would die before higher command admitted this. December 18th, 1944. At Hitler's headquarters, reports from the Ardennes were being filtered through the Führer's staff to present the most optimistic interpretation possible. Hitler received maps showing German penetrations, captured prisoners, and Allied panic. What he didn't receive was accurate assessment of the offensive's actual situation. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to be the main effort, had advanced barely 20 miles and was bogged down fighting for Elsenborn Ridge, where the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions were conducting a masterful defensive battle. The 5th Panzer Army had advanced further, but was now facing American reinforcements arriving faster than German intelligence had predicted possible. The 7th Army, covering the southern flank, had made minimal progress and was already facing counterattacks from Patton's 3rd Army. Fuel shortages were becoming critical across the entire offensive. Ammunition expenditure had exceeded planning assumptions by 300% due to unexpectedly fierce American resistance. The Luftwaffe's promised air support had materialized for only a few hours before weather grounded most aircraft. Kampf Group Piper, the deepest German penetration, was now completely surrounded near Stoumont. Piper's situation on December 18th illustrated the offensive's collapse. He radioed 5th Panzer Army headquarters at 10 a.m. requesting fuel and ammunition. The response informed him that supply columns could not reach him due to American forces across his supply route. He was ordered to break out and return to German lines. Piper's reply, recorded in intercepted American signals intelligence, revealed his bitterness. Break out with what? I have fuel for perhaps 10 kilometers. I have ammunition for one more engagement. I have 300 wounded. You ordered me to drive to the Meuse in 24 hours. I am 50 kilometers from the Meuse after 72 hours. Not because we failed, but because the plan was impossible. Piper would hold position until December 24th, when his survivors would abandon their vehicles and escape on foot, leaving behind every tank and vehicle. The most elite Kampfgruppe in the Waffen-SS had been destroyed not primarily by American combat power, though that was significant, but by logistics, the same logistics German planners had dismissed as solvable by capturing American supplies. In Bastogne, the German noose was tightening. By December 18th, the town was completely surrounded. Manteuffel's forces prepared for what they assumed would be a quick reduction of the garrison. The Americans, they calculated, would surrender rather than face destruction while surrounded. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz demanding surrender. The document, written in English, read, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation, that is, the honorable surrender of the encircled town." General McAuliffe's reply became the most famous one-word response in American military history: nuts. The German officers, confused by American slang, had to have it explained to them. The meaning was clear: the Americans would fight. The defense of Bastogne over the next 48 hours exemplified American fighting character in this battle. The 101st Airborne and attached units were outnumbered, surrounded, short on ammunition, and had inadequate winter clothing. They held anyway. Foggy weather prevented aerial resupply or air support. They held anyway. German attacks came from all directions, supported by heavy artillery and panzers. They held anyway. The German forces attacking Bastogne discovered what the entire Wehrmacht was learning across the Ardennes. American soldiers, when determined to hold, were extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The attackers needed a 3-to-1 numerical advantage minimum, more if the defenders had artillery support. The Americans in Bastogne had artillery. The 101st's artillery battalions, firing in 360-degree defense, were inflicting casualties on German forces at unsustainable rates. By December 19th, 96 hours into the offensive, the German situation was deteriorating rapidly. No major objectives had been taken. Fuel shortages were immobilizing entire divisions. American reinforcements were arriving in ever-increasing numbers. The weather, which had been Germany's ally by grounding Allied aircraft for a week, began to clear on December 23rd. What followed was devastation from the sky. The Allied air forces, primarily the US 9th Air Force and RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, had been grounded by fog and low clouds for a week. When the weather cleared, they launched the largest tactical air campaign of the war to that point. On December 23rd alone, Allied aircraft flew over 1,200 sorties over the Ardennes. They struck German columns backed up on roads, unable to maneuver in the confined terrain. They destroyed fuel trucks, creating secondary fuel crises. They cut bridges, isolating German spearheads from supply. They dropped supplies to Bastogne, 144 C-47 transports dropping 334 tons in a single day. German forces, which had advanced in relative safety from air attack for a week, were now being systematically destroyed from above. Oberst Günther Reichhelm, operations officer for 5th Panzer Army, recorded the impact in his war diary. December 23rd. The weather cleared. American aircraft appeared in numbers we have not seen since France. They attacked everything that moved. Roads became death traps. Vehicles burned everywhere. Units reported being unable to move in daylight. We have transitioned from offensive operations to survival. The Führer has ordered continuation of attacks. With what? We lack fuel, ammunition, and increasingly the will to drive into certain destruction. By December 24th, 192 hours into the offensive, Hitler's gamble had manifestly failed. German forces had advanced a maximum of 50 miles, less than two-thirds of their objective. They held a bulge in Allied lines, hence the battle's name. But it was a bulge that was rapidly becoming a pocket. American forces under Patton were driving north from the south. British forces under Montgomery were pushing south from the north. The Germans were being squeezed in a vice. Most critically, the offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves for negligible strategic gain. Those 200,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft could not be replaced. Every Tiger tank destroyed in Belgium was one less Tiger to defend the Rhine. Every SS Panzer division bled white in the Ardennes was one less division to stop the Red Army. Hitler had gambled his last reserves on a plan that required everything to go perfectly. When American soldiers refused to break,
the entire strategy collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Hal C. Patterson, operations officer for the 101st Airborne, wrote in his after-action report a passage that captured the American perspective on these crucial 48 hours. "We were outnumbered, surrounded, outgunned. By every metric, we should have been destroyed. The Americans had tactical superiority at the point of contact. They had better tanks, more artillery, interior lines. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed we would break when the situation became desperate. American soldiers don't break. We bend, we take casualties, we give ground when we must, but we don't break. Every hour we held Bastogne, we bought time for reinforcements. Every German attack we stopped was one they couldn't launch elsewhere. We won by refusing to lose." The 48 hours from December 16th to December 18th determined the Battle of the Bulge's outcome. Everything that followed, Patton's relief of Bastogne on December 26th, the grinding reduction of the German salient through January, the eventual German retreat, was consequence of what happened in those first crucial hours.
The German operational concept required breakthrough and exploitation before American reserves could react. When isolated American units stood and fought rather than retreating, they delayed German advance long enough for American systematic response to organize. Eisenhower's decision on December 16th to immediately shift reserves, made within hours of recognizing the attack, was facilitated by American logistics and transportation capacity that Germany could no longer match. The 101st Airborne Division moved 107 miles in trucks through winter weather and was in position at Bastogne within 24 hours of being alerted. The equivalent German movement would have taken a week to plan and execute if fuel was available. This disparity in operational mobility, the ability to move large forces quickly, was as decisive as any tactical engagement. American capacity for systematic response to crisis had been built through years of industrial mobilization and logistics planning. When crisis came, the system responded almost automatically. Units moved, supplies flowed, reinforcements arrived, all without requiring detailed central planning for every movement. German forces, constrained by fuel shortages and Allied air interdiction, could not match this operational flexibility. Once their initial offensive failed to achieve breakthrough, they lacked the capacity to adapt. They could only continue attacking until forces were exhausted. The human cost of these first 48 hours was staggering. American casualties from December 16 to 18 totaled approximately 8,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties were harder to calculate precisely, but likely exceeded 10,000 for the same period. These were losses neither side could easily afford, but they had different strategic impacts. For the Americans, these casualties were being incurred while buying time for a systematic response that would eventually crush the German offensive. Units taking heavy losses were doing so as part of coherent defensive strategy. For the Germans, casualties were being taken while failing to achieve objectives on which the entire offensive depended. Every hour of delay, every strong point that held, was eating into the time German forces needed to reach the Meuse before American reinforcements arrived in overwhelming strength. By December 18th, German commanders at army and corps level knew the offensive had failed. They lacked authority to admit this to Hitler. They lacked authority to order retreat. They could only continue attacking, feeding more divisions into a battle that was consuming the Wehrmacht's last mobile strength. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, the headquarters controlling the Ardennes offensive, wrote in his personal diary on December 19th an assessment that would remain secret until captured after the war. The offensive has failed to achieve breakthrough. American resistance has been unexpectedly determined. Our logistics have proven inadequate. Continuation of attacks will only increase casualties without achieving objectives. I have requested authority to transition to defense. The Führer has ordered attacks to continue. We will obey, but we are now fighting not for victory, but to avoid total catastrophe. The contrast between German and American command decisions during these first 48 hours reveals the broader differences in military culture that shaped the battle's outcome. When American commanders at 8th Corps headquarters recognized they were under major attack on December 16th, they immediately began making decisions to delay the enemy without waiting for higher headquarters approval.
Engineers prepared demolitions, infantry established strongpoints. Requests for reinforcements went up the chain, but tactical decisions were made locally, quickly, without bureaucratic delay. German commanders, operating in a system where Hitler personally approved major decisions, lacked this flexibility. When situations changed, they had to wait for direction from above. This created delays that American defenders exploited ruthlessly. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month after these first crucial 48 hours. The fighting would be brutal, some of the fiercest combat of the entire European war. Weather conditions, among the worst of the century, added suffering to the combat deaths. The siege of Bastogne would become legendary, with the 101st Airborne's defense entering American military mythology. Patton's Third Army would execute a 90-degree pivot north, disengaging from offensive operations and driving to Bastogne's relief in one of the war's most impressive operational maneuvers. The weather would clear, allowing Allied air power to devastate German forces unable to hide in the confined Ardennes terrain. But all of this was consequence of what happened in the first 48 hours. The German plan required specific conditions to succeed. Surprise they achieved. Rapid breakthrough before American reserves could react, they did not achieve. This failure, caused primarily by the unexpected determination of outnumbered American defenders, doomed the offensive from its first days. The butcher's bill for Hitler's last gamble was catastrophic for Germany. By the time German forces withdrew to their original lines in late January 1945, the Wehrmacht had suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, dead, wounded and captured. They had lost 800 tanks and assault guns, including most of Germany's remaining heavy tanks. They had expended fuel reserves that could never be replaced. They had lost 1,000 aircraft, gutting the Luftwaffe's last trained pilot reserves. Most importantly, they had consumed time. The Ardennes offensive delayed Allied advance into Germany by approximately 6 weeks. But it also delayed the Wehrmacht's capacity to establish defenses in Germany by 6 weeks. The mobile reserves destroyed in Belgium could have defended the Rhine, could have delayed Allied advance, could have prolonged the war. Instead, when Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they faced a Wehrmacht that had been bled of its best units in a failed offensive. The Red Army, paused on Germany's eastern border in December 1944, used the time while German attention was focused west to prepare massive offensives that would be launched in January 1945. These offensives would destroy entire army groups and carry Soviet forces to Berlin. Hitler's gamble to knock the Western Allies out of the war had instead ensured the Red Army would conquer eastern Germany. For the American military, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated capabilities that would shape US military doctrine for decades. The ability to absorb surprise attack and respond systematically, the quality of small unit leadership that enabled isolated units to fight effectively without higher direction, the logistics capacity to shift divisions hundreds of miles within 24 hours, the industrial strength to replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. These capabilities, more than tactical excellence in any particular engagement, won the battle and previewed how America would fight wars for the next 80 years. The German perspective on these crucial 48 hours evolved over the months and years following the battle. Initial German propaganda presented the offensive as victorious, claiming massive American casualties and strategic success. As the truth became clear, German commanders who survived the war were more honest in their assessments. Manteuffel, captured and interviewed extensively after the war, provided the most insightful analysis. The American army we attacked in December 1944 was not the same army we fought in 1942 or even 1943. They had learned from their mistakes. More importantly, they had learned to leverage their advantages: material superiority, air power, logistics, and systematic approach to operations. The offensive failed not because of any single tactical defeat, but because the Americans did not break when we needed them to break. Every small unit that held for a few hours, every engineer that destroyed a bridge, every artillery battery that fired until overrun, delayed us just enough for their systematic response to organize. We fought the battles and often won. They won the campaign by simply refusing to allow us the quick breakthrough our plan required. By the time reinforcements arrived, our offensive had already failed. We just didn't know it yet. The individual stories from those first chaotic hours reveal how a single machine, and the men inside it, could shape the outcome of the war. But behind the steel and the strategy were men, cold, exhausted and terrified, whose actions in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes would determine not just the fate of a single tank battle, but the future of the Western Front itself.
For 48 hours, chaos reigned across the American lines as small groups of infantry and tank crews fought isolated battles that collectively decided the course of the war. Those 48 hours revealed the human dimension behind the strategic analysis. These were not abstract forces moving on maps, but individuals making split-second decisions that shaped history. Staff Sergeant Francis Curry of the 120th Infantry Regiment exemplified the individual heroism that multiplied across the Ardennes. On December 21st, near Malmedy, Curry's position was attacked by 5 German tanks and approximately 100 infantry. Rather than withdrawing, Curry engaged the force alone with a bazooka, destroying 2 tanks. When his ammunition ran out, he retrieved a machine gun from a destroyed American vehicle and held the position until reinforcements arrived. His actions, which earned him the Medal of Honor, delayed German advance for 6 critical hours. This pattern repeated hundreds of times. Individual soldiers and small units holding impossible positions because retreat meant the next position would face even worse odds. The cumulative effect of these individual stands was strategic. Every hour bought was an hour for American reinforcements to arrive, for supplies to be positioned, for defensive lines to form. The German soldiers, experiencing this resistance, found it incomprehensible within their understanding of American character. Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann, captured with the 12th SS Panzer Division on December 20th, expressed confusion in his interrogation. We were told Americans were soft, that they valued comfort over duty, that they would surrender rather than die for small gains. Every house in Rocherath held Americans who fought until killed or the building collapsed. They didn't surrender, they didn't retreat, they just kept fighting. How do you defeat an enemy like that? Hartmann's question cut to the heart of Germany's strategic dilemma. German military excellence had been predicated on fighting enemies that could be broken by tactical superiority. The Poles had broken, the French had broken, even the Soviets, despite their eventual victory, had broken repeatedly in 1941 and 1942 before learning to resist. The Americans, by December 1944, had learned everything the Soviets learned but possessed industrial capacity that the Soviet Union lacked. They could afford to learn through casualties because replacement soldiers, equipment and supplies flowed continuously. Every American unit destroyed was reconstituted within weeks. Every German unit destroyed was gone forever. The weather, which had been Germany's ally by grounding Allied aircraft, turned decisively against them when it cleared on December 23rd. But even before the weather cleared, American artillery had been devastating German forces. The United States had developed artillery doctrine and technology that by 1944 was the most effective in the world. Forward observers with radios could call fire on targets within minutes. Radar-directed fire could engage targets without visual observation. Proximity-fused shells, which exploded at optimal height above ground, dramatically increased effectiveness against personnel. Most critically, American artillery units had unlimited ammunition. German artillery, rationed to a few dozen rounds per gun per day, could not suppress American guns long enough for infantry assaults to succeed. American guns fired continuously, thousands of rounds per day, creating an artillery umbrella under which German forces died in horrifying numbers. Oberleutnant Werner Sternebeck, commanding an artillery battery with the 6th Panzer Army, recorded the disparity in his diary. "We fire 30 rounds and must cease to conserve ammunition. The Americans respond with 300 rounds, saturating our positions. They fire all day, all night, without pause. We cannot suppress their guns. We cannot protect our infantry. We simply endure and die. The psychological impact of constant artillery fire on German forces was profound. Soldiers who survived the Eastern Front's horrors spoke of the Ardennes as worse because there was no respite. Soviet artillery had been heavy but intermittent, constrained by ammunition shortages. American artillery was constant, grinding, inescapable. The American logistics system, which had seemed abstract to German planners, became horrifyingly concrete to German soldiers watching endless convoys of American trucks bringing supplies forward. Even when German forces achieved tactical success, capturing a position or destroying American units, fresh American troops would appear within hours, fully supplied, ready to counterattack. Hauptmann Ernst Koch, captured commanding a camp group near St. Vith, described the psychological impact. "We destroyed an American battalion on December 17th. We counted their dead, captured their equipment, occupied their positions. The next morning, a fresh American battalion attacked us. Where did they come from? How many soldiers do they have? We killed them, and more appeared. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and 3 grow back." This was the mathematics of American industrial warfare made visible. The United States was training, equipping, and deploying replacement units faster than Germany could destroy them. Every American casualty was tragic for the individual soldier and his family, but strategically, American casualties were sustainable. German casualties were not. By December 19th, just 3 days into the offensive, casualty rates among German assault units were approaching 40%. These were not replaceable losses. These were veteran soldiers, trained tankers, experienced officers being consumed in a battle that had already failed strategically even as it continued tactically. The final collapse of German hopes came not in a single dramatic moment, but in the gradual realization spreading through the German chain of command that the offensive could not succeed. Field commanders knew by December 18th, corps commanders by December 19th, army commanders by December 20th. Hitler never admitted it, continuing to order attacks long after they had become meaningless. The Wehrmacht's obedience to Hitler, even when his orders meant certain death, was both impressive and tragic. German soldiers continued attacking through December and into January, taking catastrophic casualties, achieving nothing of strategic value because their system allowed no mechanism for subordinates to refuse suicidal orders. The American system, more flexible, allowed tactical commanders to adapt to circumstances. When attacks were suicidal, American commanders could recommend alternatives. This flexibility, which Germans viewed as lack of discipline, was actually a force multiplier. American units adapted to circumstances rather than rigidly following plans that no longer matched reality. The human stories from the German side of these 48 hours reveal soldiers who were brave, skilled, and ultimately doomed by strategic decisions beyond their control. Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a tank commander with the 1st SS Panzer Division, survived the battle and emigrated to the United States in 1953. In a 1985 interview, he reflected on those December days. "We knew we were attacking Americans. We didn't know we were attacking American industry. Every tank we destroyed was replaced overnight. Every soldier we killed was replaced within days. We were killing individuals, but fighting a system. You cannot defeat a system with bravery alone." By the time we understood this, we were surrounded, out of fuel, out of ammunition, and out of hope. The Christmas Day relief of Bastogne by Patton's Third Army marked the symbolic end of German offensive hopes. The 101st Airborne had held for a week, surrounded, outnumbered, undersupplied. When Patton's lead elements broke through on December 26th, they found the defenders exhausted, short on ammunition, but unbroken. The Germans had thrown everything at Bastogne, multiple divisions, hundreds of tanks, endless artillery barrages. The Americans had simply refused to break. The symbolism was perfect.
The elite German forces that were supposed to split Allied armies had instead been stopped by American paratroopers defending a crossroads town most Americans had never heard of. The tactical significance of Bastogne was that it controlled roads the Germans desperately needed. The strategic significance was that it demonstrated American determination could not be broken by German attacks. The Battle of the Bulge would grind on through January 1945, with American forces methodically reducing the German salient and pushing German forces back to their starting positions. The fighting remained brutal, the weather remained terrible, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The offensive that was supposed to save Germany had instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. When the battle ended in late January, the path to the Rhine was open. German forces that might have defended the Rhine had died in Belgium. German tanks that might have delayed Allied advance had burnt in the Ardennes. German fuel that might have powered defensive operations had been exhausted in a failed offensive.
Most tragically, German soldiers who might have survived to return to their families had died attacking positions they could not take, achieving objectives that no longer mattered, following orders from a leader who refused to admit defeat. The American soldiers who faced this onslaught and held would carry the memory of those 48 hours for the rest of their lives. Many spoke little of their experiences, the trauma too deep, the losses too painful. Those who did speak often emphasized not their own heroism, but the heroism of friends who died. Private First Class Richard McKee, who opened this story holding a crossroads near Lanzerath with 18 men against German armor, survived the war. In a 1994 interview on the battle's 50th anniversary, he was asked what he remembered most about those first 48 hours. "I remember Sergeant Slape telling us we had to hold. I remember believing we would probably die. I remember that we held anyway, not because we were heroes, but because we were soldiers, and those were our orders. I remember my friends who didn't make it. I remember thinking, when I was finally relieved on December 17th, that we had only delayed them a few hours. I didn't know until much later that those few hours mattered, that hundreds of small units like ours, holding for a few hours, bleeding the Germans, slowing them down, had bought enough time for the big picture to change. We didn't win the battle, we just didn't lose it quickly enough for the Germans to win. That's what American soldiers did in those 48 hours. We refused to lose quickly." The legacy of those 48 hours extends beyond World War II into American military culture. The Battle of the Bulge became shorthand for resilience under impossible odds. It demonstrated that American soldiers, properly led and adequately supplied, could match any army in the world in determination and fighting spirit. The battle validated American military doctrine, emphasizing logistics, firepower, and a systematic approach to operations. While German military excellence focused on tactical brilliance and operational art, American military excellence focused on creating systems that could sustain operations indefinitely. In a total war requiring years of sustained operations, systems beat brilliance. The German generals who conceived the Ardennes offensive were not fools. They were intelligent, experienced military professionals making the best of an impossible situation. Their fundamental error was not military but psychological. They misread American character. They assumed Americans, lacking German military tradition and battlefield experience, would break under pressure. This assumption, rooted in Nazi ideology about American decadence, was catastrophically wrong. American soldiers proved as tough, determined, and courageous as any in the world when the situation required it. The difference was not courage, but systems. American soldiers fought knowing that if they held, reinforcements would come. Supplies would arrive, medical care would be available, the system supported them. German soldiers fought knowing they were alone, no reinforcements would come, supplies were exhausted, they were expendable pieces in a game their leadership had already lost. In the final accounting, Hitler's last gamble consumed 100,000 German casualties, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and 6 weeks that Germany could not afford to lose. In exchange, it delayed Allied advance by approximately the same 6 weeks, while demonstrating to the world that the Wehrmacht could no longer conduct successful offensive operations. The Americans suffered approximately 90,000 casualties, with 19,000 killed. These were terrible losses, each one a tragedy, but American losses were being replaced as even the battle raged. By February 1945, American forces in Europe were larger and better equipped than they had been in December. German forces were weaker and poorly equipped, having consumed irreplaceable resources in a failed offensive. The most penetrating analysis of the battle's first crucial 48 hours came not from military historians, but from a German soldier writing in his diary on December 18,
1944. Gefreiter Hans Weber, serving with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, recorded observations that would be discovered when he was killed on December 23. "We have been attacking for 48 hours. We have advanced perhaps 15 kilometers. We have taken many casualties. The Americans fight and fight and fight. They do not run, they do not surrender easily. They die in their positions and are replaced by new Americans who also do not run. This is not the war we were promised. This is not the enemy we were told to expect. I think we are fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy. I think we have already lost. I think we lost the moment we attacked. We simply don't know it yet. I am very tired. I am very cold. I think I will probably die here in this forest for a cause that is already lost. I hope my family will survive what comes after. I hope the Americans treat them better than we treated the peoples we conquered. I think they will. The Americans, for all their violence in battle, seemed to have mercy. We forgot what mercy was." Weber's diary, recovered by American forces and eventually returned to his family decades later, captured the tragic reality of those 48 hours from the German perspective. Brave soldiers, fighting skillfully for a hopeless cause, led by commanders who could not admit defeat, in service to a regime that had long since forfeited any moral legitimacy. The Americans they fought were not the soft, materialistic, spiritually weak Nazi propaganda had portrayed. They were soldiers who fought as hard as any Wehrmacht veteran, backed by industrial might that Germany could never match, fighting for a cause that, while imperfect, was infinitely more just than the one Weber died defending. The 48 hours when Hitler's last gamble began determined not just the Battle of the Bulge's outcome, but Germany's fate. The offensive's failure made clear to anyone willing to see that Germany had lost the war. Some Germans, like Manteuffel and Model, saw this clearly by December 18th. Others, including Hitler, never admitted it, but the mathematics were inescapable. Germany lacked resources to conduct another offensive. Germany lacked resources to defend successfully. Germany could only delay the inevitable, while casualties mounted and cities burned. The Wehrmacht would fight on for another 4 months, inflicting casualties, defending desperately, dying hard, but the war was over. The last gamble had failed. The Americans had held. The Reich was doomed. In the decades since, military historians have debated whether the Ardennes offensive was strategic sound or Hitler's final delusion. The consensus has settled on the latter. Even if the offensive had achieved its maximum objectives, capturing Antwerp and splitting Allied armies, it could not have changed the war's outcome. The Soviet Union was coming from the east with armies Germany could not stop. The Americans could have paused in the west, absorbed the temporary setback, and resumed their advance within months with even greater strength. The strategic situation was hopeless regardless of tactical success. What the offensive actually achieved was accelerating Germany's defeat by consuming the last forces that might have prolonged resistance. In this sense, the Ardennes offensive was a gift to the Allies, shortening the war and saving lives overall, despite the terrible casualties inflicted in those December weeks. The soldiers who fought through those 48 hours on both sides did not have the luxury of strategic perspective. They knew only cold, fear, exhaustion, and the immediate demands of survival and mission. American soldiers held because their training, leadership, and logistics gave them the capacity to hold. German soldiers attacked because their system gave them no choice but to attack. The difference in outcomes stemmed not from differences in courage, but from differences in the systems within which that courage operated. The American system, for all its flaws, supported its soldiers and gave them realistic chances of success and survival.
The German system, hollowed out by years of war and corrupted by Nazi ideology, could only consume its soldiers in service to hopeless objectives. The 48 hours when Hitler's last gamble began marked the moment when this reality became undeniable. German soldiers attacking through the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, believed they were launching a decisive offensive that would change the war. By December 18th, those who survived and were honest with themselves knew they were participating in Germany's death throes. The battle would continue, the dying would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans had held, the Germans had failed. The war was over, save for the final accounting. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the shattered towns and bloody crossroads, in the stories of men like Richard McKee holding impossible positions and Jochen Peiper watching his Kampfgruppe die of fuel starvation,
the 48 hours of December 16th to 18th, 1944, wrote the final chapter of the Third Reich's military history. Everything after was epilogue, the slow, grinding conclusion of a war Germany had already lost. The last gamble had failed. The end was coming. The only questions remaining were how many more would die and how much more would be destroyed before Germany's leaders admitted what their soldiers already knew. The 48 hours when Hitler's last gamble began were also the 48 hours when Germany's last hope died in the snow.